Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
The state of Michigan is basically two peninsulas, and the lower peninsula of Michigan looks a lot like a mitten. So there's the thumb of Michigan, and southeastern Michigan, Detroit's over here, and then, of course, Mackinac City's up here, and there's a bridge to the upper peninsula. But up here is an area, there's a town called Traverse City, and there are two peninsulas, the Leelanau Peninsula and the Old Mission Peninsula. There's two bays, one on each side of the Old Mission Peninsula. I'm very familiar with the Old Mission Peninsula. I spent a lot of time on that peninsula. It is absolutely beautiful. It's this peninsula that's hilly. There's a lot of orchards, cherry orchards out there, and then also a lot of vineyards now. And so somebody, Owen, sent me a note and said, Steve, check out the story involving something happening in Michigan. And he said, this is in your neck of the woods, meaning that it's in Michigan. I don't think he knew that I have a connection to the Old Mission Peninsula because I've been up there countless times. I know that peninsula back and forth. I've mountain biked it. I've gone running on it. I've spent time there. And so the headline doesn't mention where the story is, so I might not have caught this, but a northern Michigan township of 6,000 residents must pay a $50 million judgment in a winery's lawsuit. Now, this is on appeal, but Michigan Public Radio ran this story. Tracy Samilton wrote it. A tiny township that juts into Grand Traverse Bay might have to sell assets like the well-known Mission Point Lighthouse and make massive budget cuts. And there might also be huge special assessments to pay the judgment. It comes down to more than $8,000 per resident if they have to pay this. So an attorney from a very large law firm represents the wineries. And so keep in mind that the area developed originally with cherry orchards. Somebody started growing grapes out there. It turns out it's great grape growing area. It is one of the best areas to grow grapes, and it has to do with the climate and the proximity to the water and the way the ground is. I'm not a vintner, so I don't know, but they tell me it's great for growing it. So the attorney says for many years the township wouldn't let clients of his host weddings or other events, conduct off-site catering, advertise wine tastings, or sell non-wine merchandise like branded T-shirts. And he represents the wineries who brought the lawsuit. They were also not allowed to make wine that includes more than 15% of non-township grapes. So they had to use locally sourced grapes. They couldn't sell T-shirts, and they couldn't hold events for things like weddings and so on. So he said the restrictions were unfair and unlawful, and wineries have been asking for permits for decades from a succession of township zoning officers, and they got nowhere. He said over and over and over again, the wineries tried to do things, and over again, the township zoning officer said no. He didn't say why. It was just no. He said the wineries eventually felt they had no choice but to file the lawsuit. That was after an attorney sent a demand letter to the township. The township attorney agreed. He agreed there were issues with the ordinance, and the township board still wouldn't do anything. Township officials said their winery ordinance was designed to balance the rights of the wineries with the rights of residents to enjoy the peace and quiet of the region. After an 11-day trial, the federal district judge who heard the case struck down the bulk of the township's restrictions against the wineries. He said the ordinance restrictions violated the winery's constitutionally protected rights, including free speech. He also said the township violated a provision of the Commerce Clause, which prohibits state legislation that discriminates against or unduly burdens interstate commerce. And that's going to have a lot to do with what type of grapes you're using to make your wine. In his judgment, the judge noted the township did not call a single fact witness. He included this trial testimony in his order of judgment as a way to capture what wineries had been dealing with. So the question that was asked was, Chateau Grand Traverse ever the subject of potential enforcement action by Peninsula Township? And a winery owner answered, yes. What happened? Well, it's an unfortunate event, but my wife and I were very involved in resurrecting the local elementary school. It's going to be shut down by the public school system. And one of the teachers that was there was a beloved first grade teacher who had cancer. And we decided we were going to throw a fundraiser for her, that 100% of the proceeds from the sale would go to her directly. And the day of the event, I got a phone call. And again, I've never received any sort of phone call before on something like this. It was from the township clerk. And she called me and said, I see you're having an event at your winery tonight, and you don't have a permit. I said, to the best of my knowledge, I do not require a permit if the event is not going to exceed 75 people. And she said, oh, is that so? And I said, yes, that is so. And I suggest before you call and make a threatening act to me that you familiarize yourself with our SUP. And she goes, well, we'll see about that. And it just struck a chord in me that this was a really non-concerning event. And I got in my car. It's only a mile down the road to the township. I drove down there and I said, I'd like to see the woman who made the phone call. The lady at the counter said, and she went back to the back room, talked to her for a little bit, came back out and said, she says you need to make an appointment to see her. And I said, probably in a little bit of a heated way, another word for posterior, to have her please step out of her office. I said, you can't make a threatening act like that when it's unenforceable and you do not understand your own rules. I just said, we are holding our event tonight. It's within the realm of what I can do as a winery. And I said, that's where I left it. She said, if it exceeds 75 people, we will know about it. So it was implied that you can take the implication however you want, but it was very, we're going to be counting cars and numbers. Needless to say, the event was 50 people, and it went off successfully. But they were dealing with this kind of stuff all along, being told you need to get a permit for that. You need to get a permit for this. If you do this, we're going to fine you. If you do that, you're going to get in trouble. And so they eventually filed the lawsuit. So Peninsula Township has appealed the judgment to the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. We'll see what happens there. But township officials did not respond to multiple requests for comment. A published agenda says they'll be discussing ways to pay the judgment at an upcoming board meeting. And we'll see about that, but they got to raise $50 million if they have to pay the judgment. And I read a series of other articles on this during the pendency of the case and so on. And it was simply it's a typical conflict you have, where you have a vacation area. This area is not far from Traverse City. There are people who live there year-round, but there's a lot of vacation homes, And so when you had the cherry orchards there, the cherry orchards generally produce cherries, and every year Traverse City's got a cherry festival, that kind of thing, and it was simply the crop they grew up there. But as the cherry farms went away and were replaced by wineries, it did change the tenor, the feeling you had of the area, because a lot of wineries actually run businesses on site that the cherry orchards didn't run. And they'd have a tasting room and a place where you can buy the wine. And many of them do want to be able to hold events like, weddings or receptions and so on. And there were these rules on the books, and even the rules that were on the books were being enforced strangely. So like this guy says, he goes, I'm doing a fundraiser. It's not going to make me a penny. 100% of the money is going to go to this person who needs it. It's a fundraiser. We're going to have maybe 50 people there. The township says, oh, you can't do that without a permit. Well, the permit says you only need a permit for 75 or more people. And the fact that somebody went out of their way to warn them in advance that we think you're violating the law here by not getting the proper permit, that's a problem. But it was simply the fact that they were told, you cannot do these things on your property. And by the way, if you're making wine, even though you're growing wine, we're going to regulate how you make your wine. You got to use no more than 15% of grapes sourced elsewhere. Think about this. You grow grapes for a living. You make wine, and a local board of people tell you the ingredients that go into your wine. And that's a problem. So every now and then you hear about a case like this. And again, the lawsuit was brought by the wineries, and there's a bunch of them. And the wineries have said that for years this has been going on. The $50 million judgment that was rendered by that court was representative of the lost profits that these wineries endured over the years. That's what the court said. You have a situation where the township has said, you guys can't do this. Here's how you make your wine. You can't do that, blah, 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 blah. And they've been trying to put up with it as best they can over the years. And it finally got to the point where it's untenable. And interestingly, the township lawyer even says, apparently, yeah, these rules actually aren't legal. But the board wouldn't go along with their own attorney. So now you got a $50 million judgment. And yeah, the township does own a lighthouse. That ain't worth $50 million. They got a couple other things they own, but it very well could be just a gigantic tax assessment, or it could be that they've got to sell some kind of bonds that get paid off over a long period of time with elevated taxes. And that real estate out there is already very, very expensive, and the taxes are probably pretty high, but they're going to get even higher. So like I said, I'm very familiar with it. I've ridden my bicycle, mountain bike, all over it. And I know it very, very well. It's one of the most beautiful places in the Midwest, and especially in Michigan. And so I never lived there, and I feel sorry for the people who do, because it looks like their board may have just cost them all a ton of money. So there you go. But Owen, thanks for sending that from Michigan Public Radio. Northern Michigan Township of 6,000 residents must pay $50 million in a winery lawsuit. Tracy Samilton wrote that. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Yesterday, it worked. Today, it's not working. Computers are like that.